There's a moment, and I've only seen it twice in my life, when a person stops being ordinary. Not in the way stories like to dress it up. No lightning bolt. No crowd watching. No music swelling from somewhere behind the hills. The first time I saw it, I didn't even recognize it for what it was. I wrote it off as stubbornness, maybe a little stupidity, the kind of quiet desperation that makes a woman spend $2 on 40 dying sheep because that was all she had left in the world that morning. The second time I saw it, the blizzard had already started. I want you to understand something before I tell you this. I have ridden with men who had medals pinned to their chests. I have sat across fires from Apache warriors who could read the land the way you and I read a face, every crease, every shadow, every shift in the wind carrying meaning. I have buried friends in ground so frozen the pickaxe rang like a church bell. I've seen grief and courage in every shape they come in. None of it prepared me for Mara Linfield. She was 5'2" on a generous day. She kept a tobacco tin not for tobacco, but for counting things, beans, fence staples, days. She had a way of pressing her thumbnail into her palm when she was thinking hard, a red crescent appearing and fading, like a small moon under siege. I noticed that before I noticed almost anything else about her. The sheep were skin and architecture. That's the only way I can describe them. 40 ewes that a drought-ruined rancher sold her for the price of a bad meal because he genuinely believed he was doing them a kindness by letting them die somewhere other than his pasture. He felt guilty enough to take money for them. That tells you everything you need to know about the state of those animals. And she brought them home in the back of a borrowed wagon with her 13-year-old boy at the reins, while the sky behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains turned the particular shade of green-gray that old-timers knew better than to ignore. I saw the sky. I didn't say a word. That's the thing that still sits with me, heavy as a river stone all these years later. I didn't say a word. The day Mara Linfield bought those 40 ewes, I was mending fence line on the eastern edge of my claim, close enough to the Colfax County road that I could hear wagons pass if the wind was quiet. The wind was never quiet that September. It came down off the Cimarron Range mean and low, full of early cold and the smell of something coming, the way weather in New Mexico territory smells like a decision before it arrives. I heard the wagon before I saw it. The creak and protest of dry axles, the slow clop of a single mare that had been doing too much work for too long. I straightened up from the post hole and pushed my hat back and looked down the road. The wagon was borrowed. I could tell because it had Hector Aguirre's brand burned into the side boards, and Hector Aguirre would not have been caught dead driving something that rickety by choice. The boy at the reins was Cale Linfield, Mara's oldest. 13 and serious in the particular way of boys who have had the luxury of childhood removed too early. He sat straight-backed and handled the mare with a competence that I recognized as love wearing a practical face. You don't hold the reins like that unless the animal matters to you. The back of the wagon moved. That's the first thing that startled me. The back of the wagon breathed. 40 separate ribs expanded and contracted, 40 sets of hooves shuffled against the wagon boards, and the sound that rose from them was not the sound of sheep I had ever heard before. It was quieter, more defeated, the particular silence of creatures that have stopped arguing with their situation. I dropped my fencing pliers into the dirt and walked to the edge of the road. Mara was not in the wagon. She was walking beside it, one hand resting on the side boards the way you'd rest a hand on a friend's shoulder. Her other hand was pressed to her sternum, not dramatically, just the way a person presses a bruise to confirm it's still there. She was 41 years old that fall. I knew because she'd told me once offhand, the way people tell you things they've stopped being precious about. She had brown hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had clearly been pretty before it got interesting. She didn't look up when I walked to the road. "Those Haverson sheep?" I asked, which was a stupid thing to ask because I could see from 50 feet that Haverson's brand wasn't on a single one of them, but I needed to start somewhere. "Dunmore's," she said. "What's left of them?" I looked at the animals again. What's left of them? That was accurate the way a coroner is accurate. "How much?" I asked. She glanced up at me then. Her eyes were the color of creek water over gray stone, not beautiful in any postcard sense, just clear and very direct, the kind of eyes that are always measuring. $2, she said. I waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. "Mara, I know. Dunmore sold you dying sheep for $2. He sold me sheep. She returned her gaze to the road ahead. Whether they're dying is a matter of perspective and effort. Cale Linfield did not look at me during this exchange. He kept his eyes forward and his jaw set, and I realized with a start that he'd probably had this conversation already. This morning, maybe last night, maybe in some form every day for the past month since Elias Linfield had ridden south for work that hadn't materialized and sent back a single letter that I knew contained $11 and an apology that Mara had folded to pocket size and never mentioned again. I fell in beside the wagon. "You're not going to talk me out of them," she said. "I wasn't going to try." "Good." We walked in silence for a while. The cold came off the mountains in waves, the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives and begins its work. I watched the sky the way I'd been watching it since dawn, the way the light had that copper-green tinge at the edges that in 20 years of ranching I had learned to respect. I should have said something then. I know that now. I knew it then, actually. But the truth is I told myself I was imagining it, that it was too early in the season, that the storm signs I was reading were the result of an old man's anxiety rather than genuine meteorology. I told myself that because it was more comfortable than the alternative, which was telling Mara Linfield that the dying sheep she'd just spent her last $2 on were going to face a blizzard within 48 hours, and watching her face do whatever it was going to do with that information. Cowardice wears a lot of costumes. That day it wore practicality. Her place was 3 miles east of mine, tucked against a low ridge of red sandstone that broke the north wind in summer, but channeled it in winter like a funnel. The house was solid. Elias had built it solid. Whatever else you wanted to say about the man, but the barn was a source of ongoing negotiation. Half the south wall had been rebuilt with mismatched lumber twice. The roof had 2 kinds of shingles on it because the first kind had run out. It stood the way a lot of things in Colfax County stood that year, through stubbornness rather than engineering. When we pulled into the yard, Mara's younger two came out of the house. Petra, 9, with her mother's directness and a tendency to name every animal she encountered. And the little one, Tamaz, who was 6, and had recently become convinced that silence was a superpower. He stood on the porch and watched the wagon with wide eyes and said nothing, which was exactly what he always did. Petra looked at the sheep. "They look dead," she said. "They're not dead," Mara said, swinging down from where she'd been riding the wagon's side board. "They look like they're pretending to be alive." "Petra, I'm just saying what I see." "I know." Mara paused with one hand on the wagon gate, and for a moment, just a sliver of a moment, her face showed what her voice didn't. It was a look I recognized. I'd seen it on men in cattle drives when they'd pushed through a dry stretch and the water hole they'd been counting on had turned to alkali mud. A moment of pure reckoning. This is what I have to make it work. Go get the bucket and the grain, what's left. There wasn't much left. I could tell from the way Petra disappeared without comment, which was unusual for Petra. The unloading took 2 hours. Not because the sheep were difficult, but because most of them had to be helped down from the wagon individually, their legs uncertain beneath them, their eyes showing that flat, distant look of animals who have decided that effort may not be worth it. I worked alongside Cale and Mara without being asked, because you don't ask in those situations. You either help or you leave, and I'd already chosen. We got them settled in the barn, with more care than the structure probably deserved. Mara had a system. I watched her develop it in real time, which was something to see. She separated the 3 worst ones into a corner stall where the wind was least likely to reach, bedded them deep in straw, crouched beside each one, and ran her hands over their legs and mouths with the calm efficiency of someone who had decided panic was a tool she simply wasn't going to pick up. The thumbnail into palm thing happened 3 times while she worked, red crescent appearing and fading. I started keeping count without meaning to. "Their teeth are bad," I said, looking at one of the ewes she was examining. "I know. That one's got foot rot on the front left." "I know that too." She sat back on her heels and looked at the animal. "She's also pregnant." I looked again. She was right. It was barely showing, but it was there. "Myra, if half of these are." "At least 12 of them," she said quietly. "Maybe 14. She stood, pressing her palm flat to the small of her back. "Dunmore didn't know or didn't say." "Or both. Or both." I helped her carry water until the light began to fail. Cale fed what grain there was and stretched it with a handful of dried alfalfa he'd found bundled in the loft, the last of a summer stock that wouldn't have lasted another week of normal use. Nobody said anything dramatic. That was the thing about working alongside Mara Linfield. She created an atmosphere in which drama was simply irrelevant. There was the work. There was what needed doing. The feelings could exist inside you, but they didn't get a vote on what happened next. I left before supper because I had my own animals to see to, and I walked back along the county road in the last of the day's light with the sky overhead doing things that made my stomach drop. The clouds coming in from the northwest were wrong. Too low, too dark, moving with that specific heavy urgency that meant real weather, not passing weather. The temperature had dropped 9 degrees since noon, and the wind had shifted. I noticed it as a pressure change more than a directional one, like the air was reorganizing itself around something enormous that was still over the mountains but coming fast. I stood in the middle of the road for a full minute. I thought about walking back, telling her, giving her the night to prepare, to figure out what preparation even looked like with a half-sound barn and 40 dying sheep and grain that was already measured out to the last handful. Instead, I kept walking. I told myself I'd come back in the morning. I told myself maybe I was wrong. I told myself the kind of comfortable things you tell yourself when the truth is too heavy to carry immediately, and you'll deal with it at first light. First light had other plans. I woke to the sound that people who grow up on the high plains learn to fear before they learn to name it. A silence so complete it was its own kind of noise. The world had wrapped itself in something. I lay in my bunk for 10 seconds listening to the nothing before I understood what the nothing meant. I was across the yard before I was fully dressed. The snow was 8 inches on the level and still coming, not gently, not picturesquely, but with the flat, serious commitment of a storm that had made up its mind 300 miles ago and hadn't changed it. The wind was 25 miles an hour, driving the flakes sideways, turning the view past my barn into a shifting gray wall. I stood in my doorway and understood exactly what I had failed to do. The feeling that moved through me wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite fear. It was a specific combination of the two that I have since come to recognize as accountability wearing its working clothes. I had known. I had chosen comfort over truth. And 3 miles east, Mara Linfield was waking up to a blizzard with 40 half-dead sheep, and a barn that I knew, had gaps in that south wall you could thread a rope through. I was saddled and riding before the thought was entirely formed. The ride to her place should have taken 20 minutes. It took 45. The snow was deep enough to make every step a negotiation, and the wind was throwing it from the northwest in sheets, so that there were stretches where I was navigating entirely by the red sandstone ridge I knew sat to my left. My horse, Cutter, was not pleased with me. He communicated this through his ears, which were pressed back in the particular angle that meant I am doing this under protest, and I want that noted. I know, I told him. I know. When her barn finally appeared through the white, or rather, when the shape of it appeared, dark and uncertain, like a word I almost remembered, I felt a relief that lasted exactly until I got close enough to hear. The sheep were screaming. Not all of them, 3 or 4, but in that pitch and intensity that signals distress beyond complaint, real distress, the kind that means something has gone wrong at a structural level. I got Cutter to the fence and tied him fast and ran for the barn door, which was standing open 3 inches because the latch had failed in the wind, and there was nothing on the other side that could close it against 20 miles an hour. Mara was inside. She'd been there, I realized, for a while. She was wearing her work coat over what looked like her night clothes, her feet in barn boots that she'd clearly pulled on while still half asleep, and she was on her knees in the corner stall with the 3 worst ewes. One hand braced against the wall and the other pressed to the flank of an animal that was in active labor, 6 weeks premature, in a barn that was now 7 degrees colder than it should have been because the south wall gap I had noted yesterday was letting the blizzard in. She did not look up when I came in. South wall, she said. Second board from the bottom. It's been working loose since July. I found the board, found 2 others that had been wanting to go with it. I had nothing to nail them with. I'd ridden over fast and stupid, no tools, so I used what was there. A length of baling wire from a nail on the post, wrapped and twisted until the boards held well enough to cut the wind by half. Not enough, but better. How long has she been in labor? I asked. Since 3. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the ewe with an expression I couldn't fully categorize. Not despair, not hope either. Something in between, the face of someone engaged in a negotiation they know is uncertain. The lamb's positioned wrong. I crouched beside her. You've done repositioning before. Once she paused. The lamb didn't make it. The wind outside made a sound like a handsaw, cutting through something it wasn't designed to cut. The snow was finding its way in through a dozen small gaps now, dusting the straw, and the temperature in the barn was still dropping. "Tell me what you need," I said. She looked at me then for just a moment, and something crossed her face that I didn't have a name for. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, the specific look of a person who has been doing a hard thing alone and has just registered that they no longer have to. "Hot water," she said. "My kitchen stove's been running all night, and the lamp oil and kale." Kale was already awake. Of course he was. He was 17 in that moment, even though he was 13, which is the particular age children become when their parents are in need. He met me at the barn door with a pail of warm water and the lamp oil and a question he asked only with his eyes, and I answered it the same way, and we went back to his mother. The next 4 hours are not a thing I can describe in any sequence that does them justice. Time in a crisis doesn't run linearly. It pools and rushes, long stretches of terrible waiting, and then sudden bursts of action so compressed you barely register them as you're living them. I remember the warmth of the pail between my hands and the sound of the wind changing register as the storm deepened. I remember Mara's voice, low and continuous, a murmur directed at the ewe that wasn't language exactly but wasn't meaningless either. I remember Cale sitting with his back against the opposite wall, watching his mother work with an expression of such fierce, complicated admiration that it was difficult to look at directly. I remember the moment the first lamb dropped into Mara's hands. She didn't celebrate it. She didn't cry. She said, "Okay," in a voice like a door closing carefully, and held the animal against her chest to warm it while Cale automatically reached for the rough cloth she'd brought from the house and began working on the next one, because there was a next one because she'd seen the second shape already. Both lambs survived the morning. Neither of them was supposed to. By noon the storm was still running full strength, and the situation in that barn had become something I can only describe as organized desperation. Mara had divided it into zones. I don't know when she'd developed the system. Sometime in the night, or perhaps she'd been building it in her head since the moment she'd counted 14 pregnant ewes and done the arithmetic. The 3 sickest animals in the corner stall, the next tier of fragile ones in the center. The relatively stronger ones against the north wall, where they generate body heat together. She assigned me the water and the checking. Every 30 minutes move through all 40, note any that had declined or were showing labor signs. She assigned Cale the straw, keeping the bedding dry against the wet the snow was bringing in, a battle that required constant attention. She kept the medical work herself. I have seen field surgeons work under fire. I have seen Apache medicine men work in conditions that would have broken most practitioners I knew. What I watched Mara do over those hours occupied the same category of human performance, not miraculous, which implies something outside a person, but utterly human, which is more impressive because it has to be chosen over and over in each moment against the reasonable option of stopping. By late afternoon, 3 more ewes had lambed. 2 of the lambs lived. The third ewe, the one with the bad front foot, died just before sunset quietly between one check and the next. I found her and stood there for a moment, and then went to Mara and told her directly because she would have wanted direct. She nodded once, pressed her thumbnail into her palm. The red crescent appeared and faded. "She had twins," Mara said, "both viable." She looked at me. "I need you to check on Petra and Tamaz." I went to the house. Petra was feeding the stove with the disciplined regularity of a child who had taken a job seriously. Tamaz was sitting on the kitchen floor with a blanket around his shoulders and his particular superpower fully engaged, watching his sister work without making a sound. He looked up at me when I came in, a look of such absolute, uncomplicated trust that I felt it somewhere behind my sternum. "How's Mama?" Petra asked without turning from the stove. "She's winning," I said. Petra turned around. She considered this. "She always does," she said, in a tone that was not quite certainty and not quite prayer, and returned to the stove. The blizzard ran for 61 hours. I know that with the precision of someone who counted them, not with a watch, but with the slow replacement of one kind of terrible with another. The terror of not knowing how long it would last giving way, eventually, to the exhaustion of knowing it had been going on since before memory. I did not leave Myra Linfield's property during those 61 hours. This was partly practical. The ride would have been genuinely dangerous by the second night, and Cutter was stabled and well-fed in a corner of the barn that I'd cleared by moving 2 ewes to share a stall and partly something harder to name. I stayed because leaving felt like a betrayal, though of what or whom exactly, I couldn't have articulated if you'd pressed me. Maybe of the situation itself, maybe of some version of who I wanted to be. Mara and I worked in rotating shifts of something that wasn't quite sleep. She'd take 3 hours in the house while I kept the barn, then she'd come back, and I'd take a turn on the narrow cot in the kitchen that Elias had built into the wall by the stove and called a reading nook, though I had never seen him read anything that wasn't a land deed. I slept in fits, one ear always tuned to the storm's pitch, and each time I came back to the barn Mara had done something else, adjusted a feeding arrangement, repositioned an animal, solved a problem I hadn't known existed yet. On the second morning, the water situation became critical. The creek that served the property was buried. The tank that caught roof runoff was frozen solid, not the surface ice you can break with a handle, but all the way down, a full freeze. The well bucket had gone down on its rope and come back up cracked. We had what was in the kitchen, 2 large clay pots and a tin milk can, maybe 12 gallons. 40 sheep, 2 lambs, 5 people including the children in the house, 3 horses counting mine. Mara sat with the numbers for about 30 seconds. I watched her do it, watched the calculation move through her face like something physical. "Snow," she said. "It'll take 6 times the volume to get." "I know the ratio," she stood. "Kale can pack it, we keep the stove running, we rotate the pots, we melt what we need." "It'll take hours." "Then we start now." Kale, when told, didn't complain, didn't question, went directly to the house for the biggest pot and the woodshed for the grain shovel, came back with both, looked at his mother once, and started packing snow. I stood watching him for a moment, this 13-year-old boy working methodically in a blizzard, his breath coming in visible puffs, his ears reddening under his hat, his hands moving with that same quality his mother had of refusing to allow the gesture to be anything but exactly what it was needed to be. Work. Just work. Not nobility, not heroism, not anything that needed a name. Just the decision to do what was necessary and then the execution of it. I went to help him. We didn't talk much during those hours. There is a particular quality to shared physical labor in hard conditions. It creates a kind of communication that words would only interrupt. We found a rhythm. Kale packing the pot, me carrying it to the kitchen, Petra managing the stove and the melting rotation, Tamaz. Because Tamaz was 6 and had strong opinions, it turned out about organization. Keeping a careful inventory of the full and empty containers in a system, he devised himself using a series of small stones arranged on the kitchen windowsill. Nobody told him to do that, he just did it. By midday we had enough water to keep the animals going. By afternoon we had enough to spare for the horses. That evening, for the first time since the storm began, Mara allowed herself to eat a full meal rather than the standing at the stove handfuls that had been her pattern. She sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat across from her, and we ate bean soup and stale bread, and for 10 minutes neither of us talked about the sheep. "Elias would be," I started. "Don't," she said, not harshly, just specifically. I stopped. She ate another spoonful of soup. Outside, the storm continued its monologue. "He'd mean well," she said finally. "He'd feel terrible, he'd want to help and not know how." She looked at the middle distance for a moment. That was always the problem, not the wanting, the not knowing how. I thought about the $11 letter. I thought about the $11 and the apology, the letter folded to pocket size. I thought about a woman who folds her grief down to something she can carry in her coat and gets on with it. "The sheep might be worth more than $2, I said. She looked at me with an expression that was almost amusement. "The sheep might be worth something," she said. "Give it until spring." "And the lambs?" "More than something." She looked at the wall in the direction of the barn. 5 born, 4 surviving. If the rest of the pregnancies go through, we might have 20 more by March. She paused. "At market weight in a good year." "That's a real flock," I said. "That's a real flock," she agreed. in a voice that held a question and an answer in the same breath. The second crisis came without warning, as second crises tend to. The storm had settled into its second night with a kind of grim consistency, the wind holding steady, the snow continuing to fall, when I heard a sound from the corner stall that was different from the ones I'd been cataloging. I was in the middle of my check cycle, halfway down the row of center animals, when the sound stopped me and I stood very still and listened. It was the ewe I'd been calling 17, because she had a smear of paint on her left ear that looked like a number, and I'd needed something to call her. She was one of the 3 sickest originals. Mara had been especially careful with her for 2 days, extra grain, extra bedding, checking her temperature by feel, which is the oldest and least reliable method, and the one you use when you don't have anything better. I went to her. Her breathing was shallow and fast. Not the breathing of an animal in labor, but the breathing of an animal losing a fight it hadn't agreed to enter. Her eyes, when I put the lamp close, had that specific going-away quality that I had seen often enough in cattle and horses, and once in a man I'd ridden 3 days with and hadn't known was sick until he simply stopped. I went to the house and knocked twice on the frame, which was our signal. Mara appeared in 40 seconds. She was in her coat before she reached the door. I didn't have to say anything, my face said it, and she moved past me toward the barn at a walk that contained a run. She knew before she got there. You can't always explain how you know a thing. She crouched beside the ewe and put her hand on the animal's side and held it there, and her face did the thing I had been watching it do, measured, settled, accepted. The thumbnail pressed into the palm, the crescent appearing. "She's been fighting since we brought her in," Mara said. "I know. She's pregnant. I know." Mara was silent for a moment. Then, "We can try to take the lamb early if we wait." "She'll take the lamb with her," I said. "Yes." Neither of us spoke for a little while. The wind pressed against the barn walls, and the animals around us made their continuous quiet sounds, and outside the blizzard continued, indifferent and absolute. "Tell me how I can help," I said. What happened over the next 2 hours was, I think, the most difficult thing I have ever witnessed a person choose to do. Not because it was technically complex, though it was that, but because it required Mara to hold 2 impossible things at once: the certainty that one life was ending, and the decision to fight for another one that hadn't started yet. It required her to be, simultaneously, a person in grief and a person in action, and it required those 2 things not to interfere with each other. I have never, before or since, seen someone manage that with such precise, private grace. The ewe died before the procedure was finished. I won't describe the procedure itself because some things belong to the barn and the dark and the people who were there, and describing them too carefully would do them a disservice. What I can tell you is that when it was done, Mara sat back on her heels with a lamb in her hands, wet, too small, making a sound like a question, and held it against her chest the way she'd held the first 2. Her coat was dark. Her face was exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. Cale had appeared in the barn door without either of us noticing. He was standing very still, the way he stood when he was processing something. He looked at his mother and the lamb and the ewe and back to his mother. Mara looked at him. "Come take her," she said. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and took the lamb from his mother's hands. He held it with the same instinctive competence he brought to everything, like it was something he'd been practicing for without knowing it. He looked down at the small animal making its small questioning sound, and his jaw did something complicated. "She'll need feeding every 2 hours, Mara said, standing slowly. "I know," he said. "Through the night. I know. You'll be tired." He looked up at her then, this boy who was already becoming something that 13 shouldn't require, and he said, "So will you." Mara looked at her son for a long moment. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his shoulder once, briefly, and then she went to get the milk solution she'd prepared 2 days ago against exactly this possibility. Because Mara Linfield always prepared against exactly this possibility, and they set up the feeding schedule together in the lamplight while the blizzard rolled on outside. I went and sat by the barn wall and looked at the 40-1 animals that remained. 38 ewes breathing steadily, 1 cot of 2 small new lambs sleeping pressed together, 1 boy holding a third, 1 woman measuring out milk, the storm outside unchanged. I took out my notebook. I keep one, which is my quirk, the thing I do that nobody asks about and everyone knows about. I opened it to a new page. I sat for a while with the pencil in my hand, not writing. Then I wrote, she paid $2 and the blizzard is making her pay more. She is paying it. I closed the notebook. I went back to work. There is something that happens in the depth of a very long storm, past the first fear, past the second crisis, into the long middle hours where survival has become not a question but an ongoing exercise, where the people inside it begin to change in ways they won't recognize until afterward. Petra had become, by the second night, the household's primary stove manager. She did it with a severity of purpose that would have been funny in different circumstances. She maintained a wood inventory on a scrap of paper, had developed a system for managing the burn rate against the estimated wood supply, and had twice corrected my fire management decisions with the particular blend of politeness and absolute certainty that I was beginning to recognize as the Linfield mode of communication. Tamaz had expanded his stone inventory system. By midday of the second day, it covered not just the water containers but the food stores, the lamp oil, and something he called the babies, his term for the lambs, which he tracked with 3 smooth red pebbles he'd found somewhere, arranged separately from everything else on the windowsill. Nobody told him the count was off by 1 after the ewe died. He went to the barn by himself, mid-morning, and came back and moved one of the red pebbles to a different position and sat down again with his blanket and his silence. I watched him do it. I thought 6 years old, doing the accounting on his own. I went to the barn to check the animals and stood there for a while longer than the check required. There are things you encounter in a life on the high plains that strip away the stories you've been telling yourself about how things are. I had stories. Most of them were about capability and incapability, about who could manage difficult things and who was likely to fold. Some of them were about women alone on ranches. Some of them were about 40 dying sheep and what a sensible person would do with them. Most of those stories had been quietly wrong for some time, and the blizzard was simply providing the conditions under which they fell apart completely. I had a neighbor. I had known her as a woman in a hard situation. What I discovered in 61 hours of storm was something considerably more specific and considerably less summarizable. I came back from the barn and found Mara standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the white nothing beyond the glass. "Dropping," she said. I moved to stand beside her. She was right. The wind had shifted, changed pitch. Not ending, but changing. The particular exhaustion of a storm that has said most of what it came to say. "Morning," I said. "Maybe." Maybe. She had a mug of something in her hands. Coffee made from grounds run through twice, which had become a running point of self-deprecation between us. She'd apologized for it the first morning, and I'd told her it was fine, and we'd had that specific conversation 4 more times since, which was the closest thing to a running joke we'd managed. She didn't look at me. "I don't know how to thank you for staying," she said. "You don't," I said. "Thank me, I mean, that's not what this is." She considered that. What is this? I thought about it. Outside, the storm continued its slow de-escalation, the wind backing off degree by degree. The way pressure releases not all at once but in increments, like a knot worked loose rather than cut. "I owed you," I said. "I knew the storm was coming. I saw the sky the day you brought them home, and I didn't say anything." She turned to look at me, held the look for a moment. "I knew too," she said. "I saw the same sky. I loaded those sheep anyway." The thing I felt in that moment was not exactly relief. It was closer to something being returned to its right position after a long dislocation. "So we're even," I said. She turned back to the window. "Not even," she said, "but square." The blizzard broke on a Thursday morning with the specific, almost apologetic quality that big weather has when it ends. A sudden lightening, a shift in the air's texture, a silence that felt different from the silences that had preceded it, because it was absence rather than suspension. I was in the barn when I noticed it. I was midway through the morning check, in the particular groove you fall into after 60-some hours of the same circuit, counting, touching, noting, when the light changed. A square of gray-white appeared in the gap at the top of the barn door, then brightened, and I realized I was looking at something I hadn't seen in days, a patch of blue sky, small and cold and definite. I stood there looking at it for longer than was necessary. Behind me, 38 ewes continued their industry of existing, and 6 lambs, we'd had 2 more overnight, both surviving, both small, both stubborn in the way that small things sometimes are, as though the reduced margin requires an increased insistence, added their voices to the barn's ambient noise. 7 lambs total, including the orphan that Kale had been feeding through the night. I went to the house. Mara was at the table with her tobacco tin, and I understood immediately that she was doing something she didn't often do, accounting. The tin was open and she had a scrap of paper beside it, and she was doing the math that 61 hours of emergency had prevented her from doing, not the survival math, which she'd been doing continuously, but the other kind. The forward-looking kind. The what does this mean kind. She didn't look up when I came in. Blue sky, I said. I saw, she made a small mark on the paper. How are they? 6 lambs holding, orphan is, I paused. She's holding 2, stubborn, I looked at the paper. What's the number? She was quiet for a moment, in the way of a person who has reached the bottom of a column of figures, and is deciding whether the answer is good or bad news. 38 ewes, she said. 15 confirmed pregnant. 7 lambs arrived if the rest of the pregnancies reached term. She set the pencil down. It could be a real flock. She'd said that before, a real flock, but the second time it landed differently, not as a possibility being considered, but as a fact being accepted. There's a quality to acceptance that sounds almost the same as resignation but isn't, and the difference is in how a person's shoulders sit when they're saying the thing. Myra's shoulders that morning were not a person's who had resigned. The south wall, I said. I know. Before the next. I know, Connell. She'd used my name, which was rare enough that I noticed it. I'm not sure I can explain what it meant exactly, except that in those circumstances, at that moment, it felt like a sentence being completed that had started 2 days ago, or maybe 2 years ago, or maybe in some form I hadn't recognized until now. I sat down across from her. Elias is coming back, I said. It was not a question. It was not reassurance either. It was a piece of information I was simply returning to where it belonged, out in the air, neither buried nor used as a weapon. He says he is, she said. And I'll believe it when it happens. She closed the tobacco tin. I'm not planning around a maybe. The clarity of that, the specific, undramatic clarity of it was something. Not hardness, not bitterness. Simply the decision to operate on what was real rather than what was hoped for. I thought about the folded letter. $11 and an apology. I thought about a woman who folds that down to pocket size and continues. You need labor for the south wall, I said, and the roof section over the corner stall. I know. I can spare 2 days next week. Connell. Not charity, I said quickly because I knew the word that was forming. Trade. When lambing comes in full, I'll need help moving my cattle off the north pasture, you and Kale. She looked at me for a moment. The thumbnail went to the palm. The red crescent appeared. That's a fair trade, she said. Yes. You set it up that way. Possibly. She almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. Myra's smiles were partial, provisional things, offered like currency rather than decoration. But it was there, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and then it was gone, and she picked up her pencil and went back to the paper, and that was fine. That was exactly right. Kale came in from the barn around mid-morning with the orphan lamb bundled inside his coat, because the lamb had developed the conviction that Kale was its parent, which was not inaccurate from the lamb's perspective, and had made her preference clear through a combination of volume and persistence that had ultimately won. Petra had named her Spite, which Kale objected to on principle, and which stuck anyway because Petra's names always stuck. Tamaz moved the relevant red pebble to a new position on the windowsill without being asked, then sat back down in his corner with his blanket and watched Kale settle the lamb in the box by the stove with an expression of absolute satisfaction. I watched all of this and wrote none of it in my notebook and remembered all of it anyway. The cleanup took 3 days. I say cleanup, but what I mean is something more complex and less easily named. The full work of determining what you have left after a storm of that magnitude and what you do with it and who you are on the other side. That kind of work is part physical and part something else, and both parts are exhausting and neither part waits for the other. The physical part I can describe. Snow removal, which in this case meant digging out the barn door, the yard, the path between structures. Cale and I worked through the first morning on this, with a rhythm that had become comfortable in the way that shared labor becomes comfortable when you've already done the harder thing together. The roof inspection, which revealed 3 places where weight had created stress fractures in old wood that would need addressing before the next serious weather. The south wall, which I shored up temporarily with boards from my own woodpile, carried over on horseback, while Mara watched me work from the barn door and didn't offer thanks because we'd already settled that. The other part, the less nameable part, was also happening. I could see it in the way the children moved differently through the space. Petra had acquired a specific competence in the kitchen that hadn't been there before, the competence of someone who has discovered they can be trusted with something important. She carried it differently, not with pride, which implies self-consciousness, but with ease. Tamaz had stopped pretending the windowsill inventory was a game and started treating it as what it was, which was useful work. And there was something in that was both wonderful and slightly heartbreaking. Cale was harder to read and harder to name. He was present in a way he hadn't been before, more specifically present, not just existing in the space, but occupying it with intention. He finished the orphan lamb's feeding schedule and set up a log, which I suspect he got from watching me with my notebook, noting each feeding time and how much Spite took and what her behavior indicated. He asked me, on the second afternoon, how to check for foot rot, and I showed him, and he went down the row of animals with that same quality his mother had of making the gesture only what it needed to be. On the third morning, when the snow had been worked down enough that the road was passable, and I had no practical reason to stay, I was packing the last of my tools by the fence when I heard him come up behind me. "Mr. Connell." "Cale." He was quiet for a moment. I kept working because he would say what he needed to say when he was ready and not before. "You knew," he said, "about the storm before it came." I stopped what I was doing. "Your mother knew too," I said. "I know," a pause, "but you didn't tell her." I turned around. He was standing in the snow with his hands in his coat pockets, and his face doing the complicated thing I was beginning to recognize as the Linfield version of confronting a difficult truth. Not angry, not accusatory, just very steady and very direct in a way that required a response of the same quality. "No," I said, "I didn't." "Why?" I thought about the comfortable things I'd told myself on the road that evening. The reasonable things, the coward things. "Because telling her would have made it real," I said, "and I wasn't ready for it to be real." He considered that, nodded once slowly, the way people nod when they're accepting an answer that is true but insufficient. "She was always ready," he said. "I know that now. She was ready before the sheep. She was ready when my father left." He looked at the barn. "She's always ready. I don't know how she does it." "I don't either," I said. "I've been watching for 3 days and I still don't know." He looked at me with something that might have been the first stage of what he'd grow into. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said. He went back to the barn. Mara came out to the fence as I was finishing up. She had the tobacco tin in her hand, which meant she'd been doing more accounting, and her coat collar was turned up against a wind that had shifted back to something habitual, still cold but not malicious. The cold of a world that has returned from a statement to its normal speaking voice. We stood at the fence for a while without saying anything. The land around her property was stunning in a way that disasters sometimes leave behind them. Everything white and still and geometrically exact. Every post and wire and branch carrying its precise allotment of snow. The light off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the west sharp, and lavender in the mid-morning. "I'm going to write to Elias," she said. "Okay. Not to ask him to come back." "Okay. To tell him what's happened, what we have now." She paused. "He should know what we have now." I thought about that. There were several ways to hear it. I chose the one that seemed most like her. 20 lambs by March," I said. "If we're lucky, more." She turned the tobacco tin in her hands. "I've been thinking about the Haverson property." I looked at her. "The east pasture's been empty since June," she said. "Haverson's not coming back, everyone knows it, if I could get a lease on it by spring. That's 3 times the grazing." "Yes, that's a real operation, Myra." She looked at the mountains. "Yes," she said again, in a voice that was something I hadn't heard from her before, not the measured, forward-moving voice of crisis management, not the careful voice of accounting and planning. Something quieter, something that had made a decision before she got to the fence and was now simply living inside it. "What would you call it?" I asked. I meant the operation, the enterprise, the thing she was building out of $2 and a blizzard and 61 hours of choosing to keep going. She looked at me. The thumbnail went to the palm. The crescent appeared, faded. "Spite," she said. I laughed. I don't laugh easily. I'm aware of this about myself. It's a failing I've made a kind of peace with, but I laughed then, a real one. And she watched me do it with an expression that was the closest thing to satisfied I'd seen on her face. "After the lamb," I said. "After the lamb," she agreed. "You name things after what survives." I rode home in a day that had become genuinely beautiful. The sky was the specific blue that appears after extended storms, washed, absolute, the blue of something that has been wrung out and hung up and dried perfectly. The snow on the level ground was knee-high to Cutter, and he moved through it with a complaining dignity that I appreciated. The Sangre de Cristos stood against the sky the way they always stand, which is to say they did not care about the storm or its consequences, which is either terrible or comforting depending on what you need. I opened my notebook at the fence when I reached my own property. My hands were cold, and the pencil was difficult, but I've written in worse conditions and would again. I looked at what I'd written 2 nights ago. She paid $2 and the blizzard is making her pay more. She is paying it. I considered crossing it out. It wasn't wrong exactly, it was just incomplete. I thought about what to add. I sat with it for a while the way I sit with things, which is my other quirk, the stillness before the sentence, the breath before the word. I wrote, "The sheep are worth more than $2 now." I thought about Cale at the fence, his face doing its complicated work, the thing he was trying to figure out. I wrote, "I'm trying to figure it out too." The mountains did not weigh in. Cutter stamped 1 foot in the snow with the air of an animal who has waited long enough. The sky continued its perfect, indifferent blue. I put the notebook away. There are things I don't write down because writing them down would require me to understand them, and I'm not sure understanding them is what they're for. What Mara Linfield is, what she does, what it costs her, and what it gives back. I watched it for 3 days in close quarters, in conditions designed to strip everything to its essential qualities, and I can tell you only that it does not simplify on close examination. It complicates, it deepens, it refuses. That, I think, is the correct answer to what her son was asking. It's not that she's always ready. It's that she decides to be, over and over in each moment, against the full and accurate knowledge of what being ready costs. And she makes that decision without an audience, without acknowledgement, without the ceremony that the scale of it might seem to require. She makes it the way Tamaz moved a red pebble, privately, precisely, and then returns to what comes next. I rode into my yard and unsaddled Cutter, and put him up with an extra measure of grain because he'd earned it, and because he'd communicated his opinion of me clearly throughout, and I respected the honesty. I went into the house. I put the notebook on the shelf. I started the stove. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Linfield place. I know this because Cale told me when we were working the fence line that we'd agreed to run between my north pasture and his mother's east boundary. A practical arrangement, born of the kind of practicality that doesn't need to be named or appreciated, just done. The letter was from Elias. He wasn't coming back. Not because he couldn't, but because he'd found a situation in Albuquerque that was working, and because he'd had time to be honest with himself, and because Mara deserved honesty even when it was the honest thing nobody wanted to say. Cale told me this in the straightforward way he told me most things now. He said his mother had read it twice, then folded it to the same pocket size she folded everything, and put it in the tobacco tin. Not with the counting things. In a separate compartment. I nodded, we went back to the fence. The lambs were growing. Spite was already too large for her name, which was exactly what Petra had predicted, and which Petra had said so at least 4 times. The Haverson lease was in negotiation, and the feed situation had stabilized. A neighbor 2 properties north had heard about the blizzard situation and sent over a wagon load of hay with no note attached, which was the Colfax County way of offering something you didn't want refused. In March, 22 more lambs arrived over the course of 11 days. 18 of them survived. I know this because I was there for most of it, not because anything had been arranged or agreed upon. Because it was lambing, Season and Mara Linfield needed help, and I had 2 hands and knew what to do with them. Some arrangements don't require language. They just begin, and then they continue, and then they are simply how things are.